The Triathlon Show 307. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Dr. Mehdi Kordi. Mehdi is a track cycling coach, in particular in sprinting, currently working with the Royal Dutch Cycling Federation. The Dutch team had a great Olympic Games, bringing home multiple golds and other medals, so we will discuss that, and we'll discuss generally how track sprinters train, and we will discuss some of the research that Mehdi has done, so lots of bits and pieces here that I'm sure you will enjoy. But before that, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration. Precision Hydration create electrolyte products that you can match to how you sweat, and fueling products that make it easy for you to hit your numbers. When it comes to electrolytes and sodium in particular, remember that we all have different sweat rates, and we also have very different sweat sodium concentrations. So for example, I personally lose more than 2000 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat. And on the bike, in a race, I might sweat around 1.5 liters per hour. Of course, this depends a bit on the conditions. My aim is to replace at least 70% of the sodium that I lose. So that means that, let's say for a 7.3 bike, I would need to consume at least 4,200 milligrams of sodium just on the bike. That depends a bit on how fast or slow the course is. If it's slower, then I'll need to consume more than that. But on the other hand, somebody who loses 500 milligrams per liter of sweat and sweats only 0.8 liters per hour would need to replace about 8 times less than that for the same duration out on the course. Precision Hydration's products and free online sweat test or advanced in-person sweat tests make it easy for you to figure out what you should do when it comes to electrolytes. Use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15 to get 15% off your first order on precisionhydration.com. And thank you to Roka. Roka produces exceptional quality triathlon wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, performance sunglasses, as well as prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses. If you want to go faster in the water or on the bike, a Roka wetsuit or tri-suit might be for you. Or if you just want to have a more comfortable, functional and stylish pair of eyeglasses, look to their range of eyewear. Today, I want to highlight Roka's Sim shorts, which are neoprene shorts that add buoyancy in the pool. This has several benefits in that it allows you to train the specific body position of swimming in a wetsuit without having to actually bring the wetsuit to the pool. It also allows you to learn and understand a good body position if that's something that you struggle with normally. It can help you add more swimming volume, in particular on days when your legs are tired and sinky from bike and run training. And finally, it can also help you better work on other points for improvement in your stroke than just body position. So if you struggle with body position, then it can be difficult to work, for example, on your catch effectively. But the shorts can help you take care of the body position so you can really focus in on that catch instead. They're brilliant quality shorts with great buoyancy, extremely durable. I can highly recommend them. Visit roka.com/TTS for your entire Roka order. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Dr. Mehdi Kordi. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Mehdi. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
It's my pleasure. Can you start by just introducing yourself for the audience and give us an overview of who you are and what your current and past roles in endurance sports have been?
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it brief. I don't want to send people to sleep just yet. But yeah, my name is Mehdi Kordi. I currently work as a coach for the Dutch cycling track sprint team. Prior to that, I had voluntarily worked for the Who What Bike team on the track. So, in my current position, actually, I coach 2 endurance riders on the track. The Who What Bike team are a team pursuit team on the track, which is classified as endurance, but I guess to a triathlete, 4 minutes or sub 4 minutes isn't endurance, but at least in my book it is. And prior to that, I worked at British Cycling in the English Institute of Sport, where I completed my PhD there, which looked at the physiological determinants of basically sprint cycling. However, during my time there, and most of my publications have been in endurance sport or endurance paradigms, in particular looking at the power duration relationship and its effect on performance.
Yeah, well, to compare the team pursuit on the track, we're talking about an event that is longer than, for example, the 1500 meters in running, and that's a mid-distance event. So I think it's fair to say that it's an endurance event, because that we're talking about mid-distance in running terms, but it's clear that it's very endurance driven. So I agree with you. It is an endurance event, although it is much shorter than most of our events. Still, a lot of the same training principles would apply, and. As you said, you work with the Dutch Federation, and we've just had the Olympics in Tokyo a couple of months ago, now a month and a half ago. So
it's been that long. Okay, right.
Yeah,
Time flies.
So. You took home a number of medals in the track cycling events, and in particular the sprint events. So can you talk us through how the games went from your perspective, and what were kind of the keys to success there?
Yeah, so from a track sprint perspective, we got 3 golds, a silver, and a bronze. I think that went relatively well. I was kind of aiming for hoping we'd sneak one more medal in, but unfortunately there were some circumstances out of our control. For example, a crash that happened. So generally, I thought that went quite well. So, what was the second part of the question? Like, why did we have that success? Or
yeah. So, are there any keys to success that you can point to? That, I mean, even if you felt that you could have had another medal, as an overall amount of medals, that's still more than most countries took home. So compared to the competition, you were quite successful, even though you might have had in mind one more.
Yeah. I find it very uncomfortable saying that sort of thing, because you're, at least I feel that one is inferring that you're doing something better than someone else. And I don't really know until you actually know what everyone else is doing. I guess where the strength came, what I thought we did well, at least internally, and maybe other nations do it as well or better than us, or maybe not at all. Because I thought we had the right balance of having riders' input and coaching and scientific input. Like, there was a nice blend of it, and we got everyone involved, rather than it being one or the other, like being a binary system. And that's definitely something I learned from working with the Who What Like guys prior to all this, but definitely getting the riders involved and the staff involved, and kind of coming to a conclusion of training and approach together was definitely, I thought, a strong point.
Yeah.
Also, their openness to trying new things as well, new training methods and different ways of thinking was also something that you have to give the riders credit for as well.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and in coaching, I think it's becoming quite trendy to talk about an athlete-centered approach to coaching, and that's, I mean, it's easy to say that, of course, coaching is athlete-centered, but actually implementing it can look quite different, and if the coach is just prescribing the program, then is that really athlete-centered? Of course, the coach wants to do the best for their athletes, but actually getting the input from the athlete and from the team around them as well. Like, I think getting that balance right in a high performance environment, I think it's definitely an area where I imagine that there are quite big differences still between different federations, different teams, if you're talking about World Tour cycling and so on. So
it's interesting. It's an interesting point in that, and this is more of a science podcast, but I think for me, having been a very, very mediocre athlete myself, the shift in coaching over the past 20 years, or 10 years even, has been quite seismic, where it used to be speaking like, this is what we're doing, this is the end, let's just get on with it, stop complaining, to having a more, I don't know, hybrid approach, let's call it. But I think it's having the right balance of getting the input from the rider. So, I don't know, I'm making this up here, but let's just make this example of it. If a sprinter wants to do, 400k road rides a week before a world championship, you probably have to challenge them and ask them why, and try and get some reason. Probably try and talk them out of it. But yeah, it's. I think the trick is getting the right blend with the right athlete. So it's a completely individual approach. So I wouldn't just say like it's athlete centered. So there should be an exact input and output so input for coach and athlete or staff and athlete. I think it just should be trying to find the optimal one that works, and it's really an evolution of that relationship. It kind of never really stays the same. So you can't really just say this is the model that we work to. It kind of is quite fluid. I'd be curious to know how other federations do it, but I'm going to talk about myself.
Yeah. I think there's definitely a case that it has changed over the last decade or a couple of decades. Reading a book currently by former world champion Emma Carney in triathlon, and her descriptions of the training system that Triathlon Australia had in place in the kind of mid-90s when the part of the book that I'm currently at is very much a coach-led approach, and completely different to what I think most high performance, at least successful high performance environments look like these days. But I still think that it probably exists in some corners. Yeah. But you mentioned there the kind of 100k road rides leading into the race. Actually, I think it's something that, I don't know much about, and most listeners don't know much about how track sprinters actually train. So can you describe what a typical training week might look like for them?
Well, I think most triathletes would probably not consider some of the sessions they do as sessions because they're so short, with so much rest in between. So the volume compared to an endurance athlete or triathlete, it's so small. So I'm trying to do some quick calculations. Like, some training weeks might have a total of 3 kilometers of work. So 1 week you're actually not doing more than 3 kilometers on the track, which is obviously not even a warm-up for some triathletes. And also there's a lot of gym-based work. So between 1 and 4 times a week or 3 times a week, we spend a lot of time in the gym, but it's actually gym focused. So I know a lot of endurance athletes. And again, I apologize if I'm wrong about this. I'm just stereotyping here. But I know endurance athletes use the gym or strength work as more kind of prehab, rehab, and maybe even like supplementary sessions. However, track sprinters use it as a cornerstone of their training, where their sole goal of these training sessions are to try and improve their maximum strength or some aspect of it. Anyway.
Yeah. So in a week like that, when you have, as you said, 3K of work on the track, what might the breakdown be of the session? Like, how many sessions would that mean on the track? And can you give an example of what one of those sessions might look like?
A good point. Yeah. So like it'll be between 2 and 4. So in sprinting, the team sprint is the blue ribbon event, the one that kind of shows the overall strength of the squad, I guess, and it's the most controlled. So it's a time trial, and it can go as quick as 41 seconds. However, the man one should do it, in around 17 seconds, which is from a standing lap. So their training might consist of different combinations and permutations of starts. So it can be as small as or as short as 65 meters, 125 meters, and a couple of sets of those. Another session, it could be some like acceleration efforts, which are about 2 or 3, or maybe even 4, about 200 meters. And then maybe a few flying 100 efforts, which is a 100-meter effort, but with a bit of a build-up. So let's just say they're 30 seconds effort, 5 and so. So it's not much volume at all. And I think if a endurance athlete just saw a training session, they wouldn't. I think they'll be shocked how little work they do, and how much rest they have in between. But also even more surprised how tired they are after such sharp efforts.
And is this in a race, kind of leading into a race in a specific preparation period, do they do some sort of more collecting volume earlier in the year or something like that, or is it kind of similar year round?
Yeah, it really depends on the coach and the athlete, really. I think I've heard, and we do this as well, there are some, I'll put it in inverted commas, endurance, like volume-based sessions. But, again, I wouldn't call them, to an endurance athlete, it'd probably be like a light 1 hour warm-up, if that, but it's very, very low intensity, very, very low volume. So I guess the longest road ride they'd ever do is about 2 hours, 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
And any longer ones would be as far as possible from competition. So as you get closer towards competition, all kind of volume in almost every aspect reduces, whereas intensity stays the same. So all track efforts largely all out. However, they just take out a lot of the volume but yeah, keep the intensity on the track.
Yeah. So when you're a month or two out from a race like the Olympics, how much volume might they be doing off the track?
Volume in terms of sessions or efforts or
sessions, like just sessions or total time of that low intensity training, or are they not doing any low intensity training?
Low intensity training with a month before, it's less than an hour a week, I'd say.
Okay.
A month to go. So the reason for that is, and I guess it's, you don't want to take anything, you don't attenuate any of the maximal strength, maximal power capabilities of the body, and you want to get that firing, and yet you don't want to do anything to try and dampen that response. So usually the aerobic or low intensity aspect is virtually gone.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we compare a 40-second effort, as you mentioned, it's kind of like training for the 400 meters in running, similar time duration, and I'm by no means an expert on how 400-meter runners train, but I do think from what I know that they do quite a bit more aerobic volume. Some of them, at least. I think there is a bit of a sort of polarization there, with some being definitely more on the focus on the quality side, and others being, I guess, maybe a bit of the traditional school, still having a relatively big aerobic base. Big is relative there, of course. It's nothing like the milers or 5K or 10K runners would do, but still, it sounds like, I think that a lot of 400-meter runners would do quite a lot more. But then again, I'm not sure that makes any sense, because, as you say, it can take away from, like, it's such an anaerobic effort that it's just interesting to hear for somebody who is not coaching that type of athletes at all what you're doing.
It's interesting. So with the 400 meters, I trained with a group here in Manchester in the very early noughties when I got injured from a sport. And it just so happened that this group was quite polarized. We had someone who went to the 2008 Beijing Games for the 400 meters, and there was like dribble, which included me, Well, actually, the poor stand was led by myself, and theirs is largely aerobic based, and then the coach kind of switched it to kind of more kind of shorter, sharper stuff, and the athletes actually had an opposite response, with the exception of one or two. So yeah, it was for sure. You're right there. Like the 400 meters, which is like 52 seconds for an amateur man. There's definitely more aerobic component to it, at least in a training point of view, than say cycling. Sprint cycling.
Yeah. And then in terms of the preparations for Tokyo, other than you mentioned already the blend of athlete input, coach input, and getting that aspect right. Are there any other things you can think of, or if there's nothing else that you want to highlight, is there anything that you kind of learned that you would do differently for next time?
Yeah, that's something I'm trying to drive right now. Definitely asking the athletes the kind of review process and the staff, but for the women, no. I think, Michael, at this moment in time, because we're getting ready for Worlds and Euros, it's been like we haven't really had much time to decompress as a team and think about it. So I only had 1 or 2 weeks, I can't even remember, off after the games, and we're back on it to try and prepare for the Euros and Worlds, particularly for non-Olympians. And the Olympians have joined last week. So we haven't had time to decompress and really think about it as a team. I think right now for me it's really difficult to try and think about, put it this way, I try and think about is if all my results, or if all the results we got were 4th or 5th, would we be happy with the process? And was there anything we could have learned from or done differently? But at the moment, I'm kind of struggling. But that's not to say that I don't think there is. It's just like it's too much going on.
Yeah.
But maybe in like 1 or 2 months' time, when we take time to sort of have some time off and have some proper reflection.
Yeah.
There'll definitely be a few pointers.
Yeah.
I might let you know.
One more general training question. So what is when you add up? It's just interesting to compare, and I think maybe that's not something that you consider like important because training is so different. But for triathletes, like when we talk about volume, like we add up all the total hours, swim, bike, run, and strength training, and okay, I train 6 hours per week, or 10 hours per week, or 20 hours per week, or 30 hours per week. If you do that for athletes, have you done that? Like how many hours roughly when you add up all the gym work and the track work, of course, including the rest between intervals, because that's part of the training, because you need to rest from those sharp efforts. What do you end up with?
Yeah, so including warm up, track sessions are about 3 hours long. If you include rest, the gym sessions are about 1.5 hours long. So, let's just say for argument's sake, and they do different permutations and combinations, but let's just say they do 3 track and 2 gym, which isn't atypical. That's just what? So 9, that's 12 hours, maybe a road ride, 1 hour third. Yeah, so if you include like the time taken from warm up to exiting the door, about 13 hours. And before I came on this podcast, I did check on a few TSS scores of, and I know TSS isn't a physiological measure and blah, 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 but it's something that people get a measure of, or a feel of like what it is and how the endurance impact of a training session, and they're like 6.
Yeah.
So it's not much at all.
Yeah, that's funny. I think there's a lot we could discuss about the training, but I have actually a a study that I want to discuss. So maybe let's get into that. That you were the lead author of. It's the relationship between neuromuscular function and W prime in elite cyclists, and I think this is relevant for a fairly large amount of listeners here, because we have not just triathletes but also cyclists like mountain bikers, crit racers, road cyclists, for whom W prime would be an important measure, even for some triathletes if they're in a draft legal triathlon. And generally, I think a lot of listeners are interested in physiology. So I think it's a cool study, and I want to discuss it.
But Michael, I've got to give you kudos, because on your email when you contacted me, you didn't use the apostrophe, you used the correct symbol for W prime. So any academic listening to this will know what I mean, but that's a good touch. So kudos to you.
Thank you for that. So let's just discuss first, as a background, what was the reason for you embarking on that study?
It's quite a convoluted story of how I got onto that study, these sort of studies. So, as I said to you, my PhD was in sprint physiology, but at the time, it was dragged out over 5 years, but it was part-time. Well, it wasn't dragged out, that was always the plan. So I was part-time lab technician and physiologist as well. So during my tenure, I wanted to kind of learn a bit more about endurance physiology, simply because I hadn't come from a sports science background at all. I've been an athlete, but I've been in science, but a failed accountant, but not an endurance or any sports science background at all. And there was a physiologist there called Len Parker Simpson, and I was just curious and saying, look, I want to learn more about endurance physiology. What do you recommend? And he just talked about the power-duration relationship and how he's starting to do that. So he just taught me how to actually just execute it and then get to know it a bit more. Now, part of my PhD, I had endurance riders with sprint riders, try and compare their physiology on like why the sprinters are better than endurance riders at producing max power. But part of the deal with the coaches was that I also give them a power duration test. So I collated all this neuromuscular data with power duration data, and you're able to look at it from a different aspect, which isn't sprinting, but actually kind of neuromuscular, if you want to call it that, or strength influences in the power duration relationship. And then,
can you give some examples of what that neuromuscular data might be for those listeners that might not be aware?
So the initial study was simply muscle volume. So that's measured by MRI scan. It's the same thing, you check like a brain bleed or anything like that, you can get the muscle volume. Maximal voluntary force or torque, where you have an isometric dynamometer and you press against it as hard as you can, and it can measure the force or torque depending on what. They're both the same thing. It's just force. Doesn't have a moment arm. It's independent of the moment arm. The other things I looked at in that other study was pronation angle. So pronation angle is how the fascicles of the muscle are aligned. So it's essentially gearing of a muscle, because if you have bigger pronation angle, you can pack more sarcomeres into the muscle, and sarcomeres are the most basic unit of muscle. So the more of those you have, the stronger you are, and the more force you can produce. But also you have something called fascicle length, which is the longer these sarcomeres are kind of put together in series, the muscle can contract faster. And what we saw in that original study, that it was maximal voluntary strength. We had a strong correlation, but couldn't determine whether it was the causation of W prime. Now, a muscle volume of all those factors I just sort of told you was the biggest physiological underpinning of that. So that was the initial study, which kind of I use that as the basis to go into the study we're talking about. I want to get into a bit more in-depth neuromuscular assessment of what influenced W prime.
So to summarize where we are at this point, you had found it. So muscle volume relates to the maximum voluntary force or maximum voluntary torque, and you found a correlation between that and W prime. So the
Exactly.
higher,
And by muscle volume and maximum voluntary torque of the quadriceps.
Yeah.
So not just some random muscle in your body.
So what would you say are the implications of those findings? I mean, because we can, from a training perspective, if somebody wants to improve their W prime, then I guess a very typical and normal gut reaction to that problem or solution to that problem would be, okay, I'm going to go out and do a bunch of really high intensity training and really practice that. But potentially, if it indeed is really strongly correlated with your actual muscle strength, then maybe it's more the type of training that your sprinters do with really sort of gym work that would work best. That's kind of what I'm thinking as I'm reading your study. What's your take as for the implications and applications of the study?
Sorry, the study I was just talking about was the one before this one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So that set it up for the study you're talking about now.
Okay.
And what we did, because we wanted to investigate a bit more, like what actually influences that, or can we see any other links? And if you want me to go into the methodology a bit more, and a bit more of the nerdy stuff, I'm more than happy to. Is that what you want? Or
let's do that. Let's do a little bit more.
Perfect. So we found out that in the initial study that I talked about, there are a number of limitations. Number one, that the other factors we need to try and assess to understand the neuromuscular factors that influence W prime. Number two, we only had 10 participants, which is a good number for elite athletes, elite cycling studies, but we kind of needed more. And some of the methodology could act as a limitation. So, for example, the dynamometer we used had a lot of compliance. So it was a commercially available dynamometer with padding, and it was made for comfort and rehab. So that means a lot of the force could be absorbed by the padding, and the moment arm was warping along. So we had to try and refine the methodology a bit and get more athletes in, essentially. So the good news about this one is we got a lot more athletes in from a lot more endurance disciplines. I think it was mountain bike, track endurance, a few road riders and elite time trialers. I think the beauty of this one as well is we had some kilo riders from the para tandems who I was coaching at the time. So kilo riders or kilometre time trial is 4 laps of the track, but there is a massive aerobic component, and you have to be able to have some kind of aerobic ability, at least in my opinion, to be able to perform the kilo well. And they were familiar to the critical power W prime power duration protocols that I was using. So I included them as well. So we had a really good broad range of athletes. And what we also did is we got a custom-made dynamometer, which had, and it looked like a torture chair, and I guess to a certain extent it kind of was. It had zero compliance, so you were just sitting on a very, very hard, uncomfortable chair where your body's at the right angles. You had a industry standard calibrated load cell that measured force out of your ankle. And the things we measured were rate of force development, rate of torque development of the quadriceps at 50 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, maximum voluntary torque, so the most torque you can put over 3 seconds, voluntary activation of the quadriceps, and also peak power output on a turbo. And with that, we used those to try and make inferences of almost like elimination of the neuromuscular factors. So the rate of force development, just to kind of again just to inform your listeners, is the amount of force you can produce out or torque in a very small time window. So 50 milliseconds is the amount of torque you can produce in 50 milliseconds, and 200 milliseconds is the same with a longer time window. Maximum voluntary torque is you have 3 seconds or 5 seconds to produce as much torque as you want. Now, with a 50 millisecond one, that's more neural factors. So that really is your muscle fiber type composition, largely muscle activation and motor unit discharge or recruitment thresholds, and likely to be your sort of, as well as other factors. And the maximum voluntary contractions to produce maximum voluntary torque is the other side of the paradigm, where it's just pretty much how strong you are, and it's how much muscle you can pack into that muscle, and it's less neural factors because the time period is kind of null and void now. You're taking that out. So what we saw was that the longer the time period, from 50 to 200 to maximum voluntary contraction, the better the correlation or relationship with W prime. So what that effectively implied was there was muscle activation and fiber type composition were really not a big influencer in W prime, and rather it was just essentially muscular strength and maximum force, which is really to do with probably muscle mass or muscle, some type of musculature, and maybe even sort of muscle tendon stiffness. But that is really kind of a grey area of what we saw. Furthermore, we also saw that the voluntary activation, which I've got to kind of go into a bit more detail about, is where we electrically stimmed the athletes on their femoral nerve. So we literally electrocuted them. There's also a very, very poor correlation. The peak power also showed a very good correlation along with the maximum voluntary torque. And the biggest determinant of peak power is maximum voluntary torque. So all the data suggested that if you get stronger, your W prime is going to increase. Now, I must again sort of highlight that this wasn't a cause and effect study. This was a correlation cross-sectional study. So there is still a gap in the literature that someone, hopefully one day myself or someone else brighter than me, can demonstrate that if a group of elite athletes get stronger, their W prime will proportionally increase. I mean, that will be the final argument to say that strength training is what we need. But essentially, yes, from this study, I would recommend that an athlete get stronger or be able to produce more peak power output. And you can do that by doing short, sharp sprints. You'll hit you'll hit a glass ceiling pretty quickly, in my opinion. Or you can just introduce strength training to your training regime, which should help improve the W prime.
And for getting stronger, what sort of strength training would you recommend in that instance?
Very good question. It depends on the athlete. So assuming there's no injuries and no vulnerable areas of your bodies, for example, back is the most common thing, the strength lifts, or as they're known, ironically, the power lifts, so deadlift and back squat or front squat, are quite good, simply because they're compound movements, which means they're multi-muscle group movements. And they really sort of recruit a lot of the muscles used in most linear energetic sports. However, if you can't do that and you're not too comfortable with it, or don't have access to a gym coach or someone who can help you get into that, or be able to do them properly, I'd recommend stuff like close chain movements like leg press or knee extensors or something like that. As I really think that strength training, rather than or compromised strength training, if you want to call it that, rather than no strength training, will benefit an athlete of any kind of duration.
And how would you structure those sets? Would it be targeting in terms of the rep ranges and the weights? Would you really be focused on hypertrophy, that sort of protocol, or can you just go into what you would recommend in terms of reps and weights?
Yeah, I think I'm very cautious to kind of say that, simply because the ideal situation is get them as strong as possible. Now, my determination of strength in this sort of paradigm or a viewpoint is how much maximal force you can put out in one effort. So if you translate that to the real world, that basically means 1 rep max. You can improve that. Now, I'm not saying athletes should do 1 rep maxes simply because you're doing so much volume. You really have to kind of be careful of what you do. But generally speaking, if you improve your 3 RM or maybe endurance like 5 RM, you are going to improve your 1 RM, at least indirectly. So I would just say, if you're going to do gym training, you should aim to, at least at some point, be able to do sort of 3 to 5 rep max improvement.
Yeah. And it's interesting because that's generally like the kind of range that is often recommended for endurance athletes in the literature. If you read, for example, the stuff by Ben Trønnestad, who's done a bunch of work in that realm, he would. I mean, that's what their group and all the meta-analysis and things that they've done have found that generally works best for improving endurance performance. But interestingly, the mechanisms I think that are often talked about is that yes, you improve your strength, your maximal strength through that training, but for at least my understanding of reading that literature is that they actually reference the neural component, because you don't see an increase in muscle size or hypertrophy with that type of training. So my question becomes: do you think that if somebody is really wants to potentially maximize their strength gains, and by doing so their W prime, would it also be reasonable to maybe have a hypertrophy period where you would really kind of focus on the size rather than the strength, and then build the strength on top of that, if you see what I mean? Or however?
Yeah, so essentially, just reflecting back on you're kind of suggesting that it's kind of a standardized periodization where you kind of start off with less intense, more reps, and just build up the intensity and drop the reps. Is that correct? Yeah. I mean, for sure, particularly if you're a novice and you don't have that sort of thing, experience in gym training, yes, I think repetition of doing something correctly and introducing it slowly, I think it's very, very beneficial. However, I do think that yes, it will help. I think the biggest benefits will come if you get more and more experience and be able to do more intense lifts and efforts. I think particularly with endurance athletes, they just think more is more. And strength training, I'll do like 10 reps instead of 8. But actually, it's probably better doing 6 reps or 7 reps with slightly more weight and failing than the other way around. Having said that as well, with the amount of endurance training they're doing, it's pretty difficult to do that many reps simply because all you're adding is more fatigue. So you're basically just fatiguing yourself more. So unless it's more of a means to an end, i.e. lifting more weight at lower reps, I would just suggest that's almost it's adding fatigue to it.
Yeah.
So whoever's listening to this, I'm not saying go under a squat rack and back squat without any kind of guidance or experience, your 1RM, then come back. I think with a very controlled, measured approach. But the end goal should always be a particular point in time, not necessarily just before racing. You want to have like a time point of peak strength, and you have to decide yourself with your coach, someone, what peak strength looks like for you. So it could be 3 reps, it could be 5 reps. For me, I would suggest the lower the reps, the better. But obviously, you have to sort of balance that with reality.
Yeah. One thing I find for triathletes in particular, and I don't think we're doing it wrong. It's just the nature of our sport and the relative needs of strength training. There, we tend to do the strength training as a definite supplementary activity. It would be kind of your second or third workout in a day, so you don't negatively impact your swim, bike, run. You would already be obviously quite fatigued by then, and I think we might not be the best at, or I know a lot of people are not the best at taking appropriate rests between sets, and also nutritionally making sure that you benefit from the strength training. I feel that maybe if somebody wants to focus on really improving their maximum strength, like taking care of those things, like doing the strength training as your first session of the day when you're fresh, and making sure that you have good nutritional habits around it, and resting appropriately between sets, that those might be really key things to think about. So, because that's how you can actually increase your strength and not just being stagnant. Because I do think that with a lot of endurance athletes, it's difficult to increase strength. You can do the lifting, but increasing strength is difficult when you have all the swimming, biking, and running going on as well. But for cyclists, for example, it becomes a lot easier when you only have the one discipline, and you can choose to do the strength training perhaps first.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think all endurance athletes, and rightly so, value the sessions that they think are markers of them going quicker or performing. So, for example, no triathlete's going to come out running and high-fiving someone if they've got a new 1RM max if their performances in the run, bike, or swim are reduced. They don't care about that. What I would say is you can be a bit creative in kind of sneaking these sessions in. So, for example, it could be a light day, and you get them to run to the gym, which could be, I don't know, say 4K, and they're already warm, so they have to do a few mobility stretches or cycle, and they could cycle back, 30 or 1 hour there, 30 minutes there, 1 hour there, 30 minutes, 1 hour back. And that way it kind of works out as kind of a compromise. And you can just build off that till they may or may not see any benefits. So, yes, it's difficult to persuade a triathlete, particularly one who's got success, that do your strength session first when you're fresh. Particularly as it will probably impact your later sessions anyway. But you can be quite creative in actually combining the two, and then using that as a basis to kind of build up.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, and I do think that for most triathletes, it's not a priority necessarily, but we also have a lot of cyclists, for example, listening to this podcast, and depending on the discipline and the goals of the athlete, I think that's where there is a lot more implications and interest in increasing your strength in order to improve your W prime potentially, because it's so much more critical there than in especially long distance triathlon that is the majority of the listeners. It might be for some athletes in short course triathlon that are limited anaerobically, and there might definitely be some interest in this as well. But I think it's perhaps more so on the kind of single sport cycling side of things. Even runners and rowers, we have some athletes from those disciplines listening. So that might be another application. I'm just looking through my notes here if there's anything else regarding this study that There was one thing actually, and that was you commented about the muscle fiber types, and that the fact that it's more related to size than muscle strength and size than the neural factors would perhaps imply that it's not so much related to the fiber type. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an interesting one, because would my gut reaction would have been that, well, the strength and the size would also be related to muscle fiber type. So a more fast twitch dominant athlete would perhaps be stronger and have a bigger muscle mass. So can you correct me on that and explain sort of the rationale there?
Well, I'm not going to correct you because I might be wrong. But it was just with this limited data set that we have and have used, it's really eliminating the fast twitch fiber. So if the rate of torque development at 50 milliseconds showed a really good relationship with W prime, then it would be, or let's just say the relationship with W prime was independent of the time period. So it doesn't matter whether you're producing torque at 50 milliseconds, 200, or no time point. It would suggest that the neural factors and or muscle fiber type would be at least a significant determinant or main determinant of W prime. So it's really by process elimination of an indirect measure that we've taken that out. But I think the reason for that is, if you think about it, so if you do a maximum voluntary effort or contraction to measure maximum voluntary torque, or actually, let me go a different way. So muscle fiber types, the only real difference from performance aspect, at least in my opinion, a slow twitch and a fast twitch muscle fiber is the time in which you can exert the force. So if you have the same kind of cross-sectional area of the muscle fiber, and the type 1 and type 2, the amount of force they can exert should be the same if you take out time. And that kind of makes sense with the W prime, because you don't need to do it quickly, and it's not like cadence dependent. You don't need to sort of bash out as many sort of revolutions as you can, because you can have to change the gear as well. So it's really just a matter of just getting it out. And because W prime can drag on for it can take up to 40 minutes to deplete the whole of your W prime, it kind of makes sense, at least conceptually, that you don't need muscle fiber type. Having said that, I think if you have fast twitch fibers, I think you have a very big W prime compared to your critical power, proportionally. But that's not the reason why we're looking at this study. It's kind of like, okay, what do you need? What are the determinants of W prime? Does that make sense?
Good. It does make sense, and you've definitely improved my understanding about the muscle fiber types there. Could it perhaps then be related to the fact that the type 2 fibers are more likely to, quote unquote, by default have a larger cross-sectional area, so you are more likely to have a larger muscle mass, but not necessarily you can increase that cross-sectional area with your slow twitch fiber. So that's the reason that you do see that time component being important. And I don't know if that question makes sense. It made sense in my head, though.
So just to understand what it meant, you're saying is just the time component being so long in W prime. So you can't really exert W prime in a minute, really. And therefore, because it's really dragged out, that the fast twitch fibers don't have such a significant say in it. Is that what you're saying?
I'm trying to. I lost my thought there, so I'm not even sure what I'm saying anymore.
Okay, cool.
But I think what you're saying does make sense to me. I just have this like understanding that since you have this correlation between muscle size, muscle mass, and W prime, and I would, and I might be wrong here, I would generally sort of correlate in my head a larger muscle mass and larger muscle size with a person who is also potentially more type 2 dominant.
Yeah, as would I.
Yeah. So that's why. So, but you also have no correlation between you see this dependence on the time. So when you have a very short rate of force development, 50 milliseconds, then that sort of, I understand what you're saying there, that's very neural, and it's if type 2 fiber dominance would be important, then you would see a very clear difference at that time point. I guess the conflict in my head is that doesn't muscle size also pose such a conflict in that muscle size might be related to fiber type in that the people with a larger muscle size are likely to be more type 2.
Mike, you're absolutely right in what you're thinking. Like, the evidence does suggest that. So don't think you're not you're thinking something sort of stupid there. That is something that we can't actually prove. So we, as I said earlier, we're using this I don't know how to call it, like a holistic measure, let's call it, of explosiveness or neural factors, which includes fast twitch fibers, to kind of eliminate it rather than say anything else about it. But I think one thing I will say is that in studies I've done, sprinters, so very, very successful world-class sprinters, have very, very low proportion of type 2 fibers as people might expect. But track sprinters, that is. And the reason for that is, I'm kind of shifting into sprint physiology here to make my point here. So let's assume sprinting is fatigue-free, just for argument's sake. It's not, but let's just assume it is. So watts are produced by torque over crank revolution times cadence, or angular velocity. And that creates power. Now, and that's the same, or force times angular velocity or speed is the same in any modality of sport or linear energetics. So whether it's rowing or whatever, that's what creates propulsion. Cycling is one of the only sports, with the exception of rowing to a certain degree, because you can change the inboard and outboard, but that's discussed another time, that you can actually change your cadence quite aggressively. So you can do, so the stronger you are or the less fast twitch fibers you have, you can gear up and just basically press against it. Whereas if you have more fast twitch fibers, or a better peddler, as it's called, you can gear down and still have the same speed. So cycling provides a way you can almost mask your type 1, type 2 properties, unless you do like a max cadence test or a torque cadence test where you can see what your max cadence is. So it's really difficult to kind of split it out in what we're saying. And this study is more just saying, yeah, it's likely not to be fast twitch or muscle fiber type dependent, but we can't say for sure it is. It's more likely to be eliminated than not.
Yeah, got it.
And so sprinters, the point I'm making with sprinters, they have their max cadences compared to endurance cyclists. So people who do like hundreds of kilometers a week, their max cadences aren't different on average than those guys. So that basically means, like, they take a chain off and sprint as fast as you can. The number they get, the highest number they get, isn't so different in some cases lower than endurance riders. However, the thing that really separates them is the max torque. So basically, their performances can be adjusted on gearing up or gearing down, which again hides whether the fact they've got fast twitch or slow twitch muscles. But you're not wrong.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
Sorry, I've rambled on a bit there, Michael.
No, it's great, and I think perfect to hear sort of not just the paper as read out from the abstract, but talking about it and discussing around it. That's what this is about, and I really enjoy it. So another paper that I want to discuss just a bit more briefly, perhaps, but it's something that we have discussed in some episodes on the podcast previously, aero sensors. And you have a study where you have investigated the reliability and sensitivity of the Nocio Connect on-bike aero sensor. So can you just briefly discuss what you did there and what you found?
Yeah, we actually looked at 3 different aero sensors to assess for this study, and we were looking to publish the results of that. So we stuck all 3 in a wind tunnel to see like how they would react and things like that. And we just thought the Nocio was the easiest one to use, and we just thought it was more suitable. And what we saw in the wind tunnel, when using the range they're calibrated at, they're all pretty good in terms of measuring what the wind is measuring in the wind tunnel. But we just thought that the Nocio was just suited on a number of things, and it has the wider range of error. So a better range of error. So if you calibrated it out, say, I don't know, 35 kilometers an hour, it had a better range outside of that, whereas others just showed, it had to be within that. So we didn't just pick the Nocio because we felt like it. There was actually a reason why. And then we looked at its reliability and sensitivity. And the reason for that is there's a number of reasons. First one, reliability just simply means like if you run it again and again and again and again, what's the noise? So if you have a human, you have a power meter, you have speed sensor, and every measuring and the Nocio, and every measuring device has its own error. So if something says 400 watts, that's plus or minus something. It's giving you exactly 400 watts. So the idea of the reliability is if you get a rider, the wheel instrumentation, and repeat the task again and again and again, what is the noise and what's the signal? And that's what we did. So we got them on the bikes, the track bikes, and just repeated the same runs again and again and again. And that just simply gives you the value of, okay, how much, at the most fundamental level, how much of a difference do I need to see for it to be a difference? Right, I know it to be a difference. Rather than, okay, that's just noise, that could have been me moving around, that could have been the power meter, that could have been something else. The sensitivity is then trying to take it one step further, which is, okay, I've seen a change, but okay, how good a change was it? And kind of differentiate between change A and change C, for example. And the way we did that was, in my eyes, quite clever, if I may say so myself, but it's something that's been used before by, I think, Tom Compton from back in the day, and some people who might know him. And we kind of bastardized that and tried to make it fit our thing, which was, we got some laser cut discs, flat laser cut discs, and a kind of a aerofoil rod, stuck it on the bike. And before we stuck it on the bike, we run them in the wind tunnel to see exactly what we should be seeing as a difference or changes in resistance, and also run it mathematically, so theoretically, to make sure it was correct. And then we got them to repeat the same runs but then adding the discs of different sizes and seeing whether the no-show could identify it or not. And we managed to, I think they were as small as 4 centimeters each disc, and went up to 10 centimeters. And we saw, generally speaking, that, they were able to see these differences, which I think equates to 4 watts at, I think it was 45k an hour, which is pretty sensitive. So, I mean, it is great news for the user, which basically means that if you can find out your reliability, that if you don't change your helmet or anything like that, you know what a difference should and shouldn't be. Or at least give yourself a protocol of how to do something for improve yourself. So, yeah, sorry, that's just a very long summary of the experiment.
Yeah, and no, that's great, and that's really, I think, the key takeaway that I wanted to hear there is, is it even reliable and sensitive enough in the first place to be a usable tool? And I don't know, were you working with Hoob Wattbike at the time? Because I do know that they, in addition to other testing, wind tunnel and general track testing, I talked to Dan Bigham, and he talked about using some of these aero sensors with the Hoob Wattbike team. So was that around the same time, or was it before?
It wasn't around the same time. It was actually, the data collection was done pretty much this time last year. Dan and Hoob Wattbike had definitely introduced me to the No Show Connect, but we didn't go with the No Show because of that relationship. We were just introduced to them to at least have the initial, like I said earlier, with the 3 other aero sensors we used, but I only got introduced via No Show and the concept and the product through Dan. But it wasn't because of that I ran it.
Okay.
I used it.
Yeah. One more question on that. Does it matter if we know? Can it even be measured? Like, I don't know off the top of my head if there is a method that can really confirm the validity. By that I mean, like, is it accurate in terms of measuring for example, the CDA? Or is it good enough if we want to, for a use case perspective, we want to just see the changes when we, for example, change the helmet or the position, that it's reliable and sensitive? Do we know any sort of validity studies? Is it important? What's your view on that?
So validity is so yeah, there are 3 aspects: reliability, sensitivity, and validity. And they all have benefits. So if something's valid, you don't need reliability and sensitivity, because if the number is what it's telling you, then that's what it's telling you. And then obviously you can add the sensitivity to it, because then obviously there are differences, and therefore you don't need reliability. In measuring CDA, it's almost impossible to run a validity study, simply because what is valid? What can you compare it to? So when you have to run a validity study, you have to have a gold standard that you have to compare it to, and that gold standard is going to have its own limitations as well. So I guess someone listening to this would be like, well, obviously the wind tunnel is a standard. Yes, true, to a certain extent, but it doesn't take into account the bends of a velodrome or anything like that. It's quite cold for a rider, so they might move around a lot. In my experience, if you're in a wind tunnel, you see riders like taking these completely different positions, way more area than they are on the track, or not, and just marrying the two doesn't always. Actually, more often than not, they're not the same number. And ultimately the calibration of the balance in the wind tunnel is probably different from the calibration of all the instruments in the bike. So I think from a CDA point of view, and I'm not an expert on this, but I definitely from my experience of measuring CDA and understanding of it, if there isn't quite a valid, almost be impossible to run a validity study, simply because we don't really know what the standard is. So one thing I definitely recommend to most people is, if you're going to do an aero test with an aero sensor, or even a wind tunnel, it should be for that and that alone, that time period. And if you want to do it again, you run your baselines again and do changes. So don't, I just wouldn't say, I wouldn't walk around saying, my CDA is at like 0.173. And I did it 2 weeks later and it was 0.20. I'm rubbish. Or something's not right here. It's just the way it works in terms of, it's just the way it is, because this is never going to be the same. And the aero sensor has to be in exactly the same spot, exactly the same point, again and again and again. And just by the law of averages or probability, it's going to probably move slightly, which means the CDA measures are going to be off slightly as well. So I would just say and this is just my opinion, someone else might have a different one, which is if your CDA, if you have a wind tunnel test or a track aero test, just use it for that time period and use it as a snapshot and do changes from the baseline, rather than just taking it as, that is my CDA, I'm going home now.
Yeah, no, that is definitely the message that has come through in other interviews and conversations I've had as well, and makes complete sense. Now just about the future, what's next for you? Do you have any research projects, or are you focused on the coaching side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I always I love coaching. I just love interacting with the athletes, and that is something I just love doing. However, I'm always interested in like research, and so I've still got research in the power duration stuff coming out, and sprint. So that's not going to change, simply because I enjoy it, and I think a lot of my work and thoughts are quite hard to be fact checked, if that makes sense. So I quite like it being published, because it means there's two academics or anonymous people that the editor's given it to that also thinks that what I'm thinking and writing is valid, rather than me just sitting in a room thinking, I'm great, and therefore this is amazing. So I definitely am currently publishing, and will publishing research. And also I think it's one of the frustrations I had when I got in sports science was everything seems so guarded. And I do want to get the knowledge out there, because hopefully someone might apply it or think it's rubbish and make it better and just move the game on. I really think that that collaboration and using other people's work to make things better is something that isn't done enough. So I'm just trying to get everything out there, and if anyone wants to use it or improve it, or just read it and go, that's a load of garbage, I'm never going to do that again, or never do what that guy did. Great.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that point, and definitely I appreciate that's what you've done here on this podcast, getting your information, your knowledge out there to the listeners, and that's something that I think I'm very appreciative of all the coaches and scientists coming on here and doing the same, and I know the listeners are too. So thank you for that. And now let's move on to the rapid fire questions. So take just one sentence to answer each of these. And the first one is, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource?
Google.
That's a good one. If I specify related to sports or science.
Sci-Hub.
Yeah.
Can I say that? Is that illegal to say that? Like a friend?
I've mentioned it once, I think, before on the podcast. So
okay, an official one. Don't know.
Sci-Hub is fine. Sci-Hub is
fine.
Yeah. What's an important habit that you've benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
So can you repeat that again?
An important habit that you have benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
Don't be afraid to admit you're not right and swallow your ego.
And who's somebody that you have looked up to or that has inspired you?
My old rowing coach, Chris George. He's actually trying to go for Kona now, and he's 75, I believe. Yeah, and he's the one who just told me, he taught me how to row better. I'm a former rower, and it's the way he did it all. Basically, he just went in the boat with me and just went, no, this is how you row. And just kept doing it until he just broke me down. But I'm really indebted to him because I learned so much from him and he just did it all for free. So, yeah, I'd definitely say Chris George.
Yeah, amazing trying to go for Kona at 75. Let's hope that Kona happens sooner rather than later, because it's, I don't know if you've heard, but it's postponed again from October to February.
Oh, was it actually? I heard the rumor that it was 2 weeks ago, but it's actually confirmed now.
Yeah, it is. It is confirmed, and there's a lot of rumblings about that.
Was it? I'm taking this because of COVID, right?
Yes, because of the local restrictions in terms of
right.
So it's not something that Ironman themselves have decided. I think the discontent with Ironman is perhaps related to not appointing a different world championship now that it will be the second year running that they haven't actually had an Ironman world championship when they could do a venue where people from most parts of the world can travel to and where it's possible to host a race, because they're running. Obviously, a lot of other races are going ahead now. So there's a lot of discontent around that around the triathlon communities.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
Did they just move it to February?
They moved it to February, yeah, and but then the question mark is around whether things will actually be better in February right now. Because
I shouldn't laugh, but that's a very, very good point.
Yeah, because that's what happened last year as well, as I said, and then February did not happen this year of 2021. So yeah, we'll see. It's interesting to follow. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I bet it is.
Yeah. Well, one more thing. Where can listeners follow you? Our social media, ResearchGate, and so on. What are the best outlets for that?
I don't know what are the best ones, but I am on social media. I'm on ResearchGate, so I think all the papers that you've brought up, and more, are on there, and I always upload them on there as and when they're done, so they're free. Or at least I think they should. Yeah, I don't know what the rules are, but I put them up there anyway. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, but I don't think that's a good resource for endurance. But yeah, I'm on.
Well, if somebody's interested, I'll put
just Mehdi
put it in the show notes.
I think my Twitter handle. That's the right word, is it? Handle, yeah. So it's Mehdi Kordi, and I think Instagram is Mehdi Kordi 11. I think that's the one.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mehdi. I really enjoyed this conversation. And congratulations on many medals that you've contributed to in the Olympics. That's a great achievement. So, good luck with the Euros and other races coming up.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
I hope you enjoyed that interview. I'm sure that some of you will be wondering why we're talking track sprinting on a triathlon podcast? And the simple answer is curiosity. As you heard, the Dutch track cyclists are among the best in the world, as we clearly saw in the Olympics. And even if their training might not be directly applicable to triathlon training, talking to coaches in any high-performance environment and learning about their practices in any sport or arena definitely indirectly contributes to an increased understanding of your own sport. And you can always gain some insights and even just understanding better how to think about training and the process of training. I think those sorts of things are always really valuable. An analogy to this would be that some of the greatest musicians in the world play not just one instrument, but multiple instruments. So, and that can be an advantage for their main instrument as well. Or closer to home, look at swimming. The top swimmers can do all strokes really well, even if they might specialize in just one of the different strokes. So I hope you enjoyed it, and do send me feedback either way. That's always appreciated to learn more about what you like, why you like it, what you don't like, why you don't like it, and so on. So you can always email me with feedback for any episode. And if you want to check out the show notes for this episode, you can find them on scientifictriathlon.com with links to the papers we discussed and Mehdi's social profiles, as well as some related episodes. First, we have aerodynamic testing in the field with Michael Lieberson, where we talk about different aero sensors. So that's related to the last topic that we discussed here with the No-Show Connect aero sensor. Also to two very recent episodes with Nate Wilson and Adil Tveiten, who are the coaches of the gold medalists from Tokyo in the triathlon, in the women's and men's race respectively. So if you want to hear more about Tokyo preparations from a triathlon perspective, then go and have a listen to episode 303 and 304. If you're interested in taking your triathlon to the next level, then do check out our coaching services and training plans. We would be glad to help you reach your future goals, take your fitness to another level, and help you out in any way that we can. Also remember to check out the training camp that we have planned for the end of March, early April of 2022. You can find more information about that on scientifictriathlon.com. There is a training camp link in the menu bar. Big thanks finally to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Go and take their free online sweat test to find out how much sodium you lose in your sweat and get a free hydration strategy for your next race, and get 15% off your first order of electrolytes or the Precision Fuel energy product range with the promo code THATTriathlonshow15. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses, and get 20% off your order with the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.